Well, it's been a while since the last podcast, and Pat is still nay wheel, so thanks to the coach for stepping in. We discussed the U-turn by the Westminster Government on the winter fuel allowance. Does anyone have any interest in where that's going to come from, how it's going to be paid? Because it was the big accusation levelled when the SNP rose to the challenge. And what about the impact it makes now on the SNP's policy, with Labour trying to make it look as if the Scottish payment will just be £100. It won't. We try to clear some of that up. We look too at the aftermath of the Hamilton by-election, and there's no getting away from it. It was a really bad loss by the SNP. There was no mention of independence, and the candidate was not as local as the truly local David Russell. And that seems to matter in an era where people have lost trust in parties. They trust their own guy on the ground. What does that say about the candidates chosen so far for the SNP in the Scottish election? We look as well at Israel and Gaza. Breaking news that the British government has taken sanctions out against 2 Israeli cabinet members. But that's not going to go anywhere near placating the 300 civil servants who've written a letter objecting to the British government's support of the Israeli government and have been told that if they want to keep objecting, they can resign. That and much more in the Leslie Riddick podcast on social media and leslieriddick.com. Those are the headlines. Now for the podcast.
Well, hi chums, and welcome to this week's Leslie Riddick podcast. Unfortunately, Pat is still on the Pat and Mick, and he's nae Affy Wheel. Not, as Leslie tweeted out the other day, Affy no wheel. He's just got a recurrence of the dreaded lurgy. Affy no wheel is serious. Nae Affy wheel is just nae Affy wheel. So today you've got the coach in for a recording rather than just lobbing in thoughts from afar. I have to confess, though, right at the top, I have absolutely no knowledge of or passion for football, so all the Dundee United fans might be a bit let down this week. I hope that's the right type of Dundee, Leslie.
It is now.
Thank goodness. In fact, I couldn't honestly say that I've ever watched a whole football match from start to finish.
Right, and I think you're digging the hole too deep now.
So, Leslie, as usual, barely anything has happened since the last time, which is to say the last time that the podcast was actually recorded, rather than the last conversation we've just had for the last 50 minutes, where I had asked for permission to record, but sounds as a 2-stage process. You need to ask and then record. So that's a lesson learned for the old future.
Indeed, we have had the perfect podcast.
Joyce podcast.
I know, Pat, if you're listening, look, everybody makes this mistake, and also
maxima culpa.
Yeah, but me also, because as a sort of person on the other end of this, it normally does a little American recording beginning or something like that, which I should have noticed didn't happen. So hands up all round.
Yes, it's the only thing I didn't get to test. I had been running around trying to get a proper microphone, and then the only one I could get was a complicated setup with a box of tricks that needed to be plugged in and a driver downloaded and then synced and something else. So there we go. Anyway, where to start?
Sorry, there's just a release of nervous tension here now.
You were up late for the old by-election, and so was I. I'm normally standing in a cattle shed at Ingleston for election counts, so it was quite exciting for me to be on the sofa with a Coca-Cola and a biscuit, rather than being tortured waiting for the votes to be slowly counted, and you were in the studio.
And I should point out, in case people think you're some sort of, concrete hall election night.
No, I was an election agent for Joanna Cherry for
and
many
indeed,
years.
You pointed out, sorry, this will now be referred to as the last time throughout, that you actually, your first time tramping the halls in Edinburgh was with Margot MacDonald back in 2011.
Yeah, so I campaigned for her in 2006, and I was at the count again in 2007, although that was back in the old halcyon days when the electoral people, whoever it is they are, I think it's the UK government, forked out for a carpet, and they don't do that any longer. So you just have to stand in the bare concrete for sort of 4 or 5 hours, which after you've been up since 6 o'clock in the morning, pounding the pavements and putting out A-boards, is absolutely torture.
Right. Okay. So it does feel to me then that I'm sort of, the least experienced in this conversation. And also, I've got to say, I just should confess, I hadn't actually visited Hamilton, Stonehouse or Lark Hall in the run up to the by-election, but I was pulled in as a kind of observer, commentator on the night by the BBC Scotland. And there's just no two ways. This was a really bad result for the SNP and for independents. Uh, everybody by now knows that the much pilloried Labour candidate won, Davy Russell. And I haven't actually really heard anybody from the SNP making any sort of it's all very well to point out, and I have now had a look at the various versions of how much Labour's vote has sort of decreased from the halcyon days of the 2024 by-election. And actually looking at that, it would seem that Labour's vote is actually down 18% from 2024. It's only down 2% from 2021, but this was meant to be part of the roller coaster. So, according to many people, including the sacred "he must be obeyed" John Curtis, that's not enough. The kind of level of win that the Labour had at the Hamilton by-election isn't enough to let them springboard over where the SNP are sitting at the moment and win the Scottish elections next year. But this is really pretty poor. And I got to say, in the studio, there was quite a lot of shock, albeit Angus Robertson, who was there from the SNP, managed to remain sort of sphinx-like throughout. You wouldn't really know what he was thinking. But I didn't hear anybody kind of come anywhere near being able to recognise the level of defeat that this represents. And it really does. The things that people were saying at the time, quite interesting. Paul O'Kane was there from Labour, and he was basically saying that everyone was underestimating the importance of localness in all of this. And, again, you might just shrug that off and think that's not, nah. But the point was, I think, if you've got two governments that seem to have lost their way in the eyes of a lot of voters, they've just kind of given up thinking that there will be dramatic change coming from either Labour, courtesy of all their, betrayals, basically on the benefits front particularly, and the Scottish Government, the Hamilton city centre, town centre is still described as a kind of, wasteland. There was a proposal locally to move a neonatal unit, which was explained away by the SNP candidate as just an expert says that has to happen. If you're living in Hamilton, it'll just feel like nothing ever changes. And there needed to be a feeling that there was something, a goal to work towards. 18 leaflets apparently from Katie Loudon, the SNP candidate, and not a mention of independence. And in any case, as Jonathan Shafi wrote in a good article today, just mentioning independence is no good anymore. It needs to be translated into here's the way that this would improve that. We need to have something beefier, and none of it was there. But the point about the local thing, Paul was saying when they were going around with Davy Russell, and everybody will know he's the guy that didn't pitch up for debates. He didn't really string together sentences particularly well when he did, and was kind of a bit surprised looking at the obvious points that were put to him by the fearful beast of STV, Colin Mackay, the political editor. But the point was, when they were taking Davy around, apparently, people would say, oh, that's Davy, the guy that we see down at the bowls. Or, oh, that's Davy, the guy that volunteers at the hospice. That's Davy that does various other charities. That's Davy that does a blooming karaoke. And you've got to say, that's Davy that's a member of the Orange Lodge. So the point is that if you've lost faith in everything else, government-wise, it probably looks like a sensible thing to just get one of your own in there, because he's going to at least just represent you and your interests in Hamilton. And it looks like that's what happened, allied with 2 months of campaigning by Labour. They just camped out there. And I know Jackie Bailey said the last time I was in that BBC studio was the Rutherglen by-election in October 2023. And at the end of that, when they won, she said, thank God for that, I can get home now after 2 months. So she had actually been camped out there for 2 months. And I suspect similar had happened here. Now, I don't know, the SNP could have put the same level of effort in, but they just decided they were going to basically trail Davy Russell around every door and stress the point that he had these local credentials. And basically, they managed to succeed over all the appalling stuff that Labour has done at Westminster level And the council, which generally speaking, councils are generally speaking so remote, they are much hated around the country. You'd have to say South Lanarkshire is is definitely picking up a lot of negative vibes, and that's a Labour-run council. So Labour's success there really requires somebody to think very deeply. And as far as I can see, the kind of candidates the SNP is favouring are not necessarily, I'm not saying that Davy Russell's some kind of local hero, advocating community buyouts. Hey, let's buy Hamilton, let's roll our own and kind of, a sort of left-wing perspective on very much. He's not. But the kind of, if you're putting technocratic in any way parachuted in candidates who are not able to advocate for the local area and are not credible to local people, that is just a losser. And I think the SNP's vetting policy, I know from one woman who looked like a complete dancer for the constituency she was in, but she didn't have experience at Scottish parliamentary level. So she was doofed out. She wasn't even passing vetting. So I don't know, you'll have much more experience of that, Fraser.
I mean, I think that's a really a big problem. And okay, he wasn't, super articulate, but he was the kind of local person that was really embedded in lots of local networks, as you say. He looked like a real person. He is a real person. He was much more three-dimensional. Labour had a way better ground campaign, and one of the problems in politics is that once you start going down, you have fewer and fewer people to come out to support you, and it's a kind of downward spiral. If you look at a lot of the candidates that have been selected for the main political parties, I know Labour said that they were struggling to get candidates for Holyrood. Equally, there's been little to no competition in some seats and a bit of competition in others for the SNP. And you've got people coming through in their sort of early 20s that don't have any experience at all. I mean, there might be a local councillor, but they've actually had no other paid employment other than perhaps being a sort of comms person or some kind of constituency caseworker for an MP or an MSP, and they think having worked for both, I've worked for an MSP and an MP, makes them actually doubly qualified rather than zero qualified. It also struck me, Leslie, as it was a very kind of middle class campaign that the SNP seemed to be running. It was a bit sneering. John Nicholson was doubling down on that even after the vote. Nobody seemed to kind of countenance the idea that Davy Russell had won. It was basically insinuating that he was too thick to be an MSP. But, the guy was a service manager at Glasgow City Council, responsible for something like 2,000 workers under him. But you've got John Nicholson saying that, he would struggle with committee work, but maybe brighter members would cover for him initially. The local campaigning, I think, is a real struggling point for the SNP, that the Labour Party are now way ahead in terms of their technical ability.
And just on that technical point, you're just slightly popping, my dear, just to warn you. So just a couple of inches back from the mic and all will be well.
See, this is the take two. We never had a single problem the first time
It's
around,
totally
but there we
it.
are. It's always the way. So, yeah, I mean,
Technicals.
Well, the SNP's main campaign technology was launched sort of 2005-06 in the lead up to the 2007 Holyrood campaign. I think the iPhone was originally launched in 2007. If you imagine trying to use an 18-year-old iPhone now, it'd be barely functioning. Labour are way ahead. There was a plans put in place in the aftermath of the 2017 Westminster disaster for the SNP to radically overhaul that system, but all these things were cancelled by Peter Murrell with no explanation. And you've got a system now that just doesn't function in the way that the Labour Party are able not just to sort of identify their own voters, but actually use technology to say, well, here's the people that are voting for us. Find me people that look a bit like them in terms of demographic and age and profile elsewhere in the constituency, so we can go and speak to them. So the SNP are really, really far behind in its technology, and actually had to bring a number of motions to conference to try and force a binding resolution to make the sort of HQ team pursue these changes. Now, some of that is starting to get underway, but it's way too late, and we're seeing the problems that are being thrown up, both in the terms of the type of candidate that are being selected and in the way that they actually physically carry out their business.
And the other thing that's really come to the fore is criticism of John Swinney for basically trying to whack reform. It's basically a two horse race, SNP reform, essentially bigging up reform. And I've got to say, I worried about this from the minute that anti-far right conference was called together, because I mean, essentially, the Scots do love an underdog. And when you get all the great and the good basically in to say these guys are BAMs, it starts to kind of tilt the thing the wrong way. It just needed to be some tangible gains, some action, an active looking government, not falling back constantly on mentioning the Scottish Child Payment. We've got it. It's good. Everyone thinks it's great. Yes, everything should be a lot better if the British government would pick that up. Yes, we've got that there's more progressive taxation here. Again, policy suggests that if Westminster copied that, poverty would be much remedied. We've got that, and we've got all the advantages of the glory years of the SNP. But there you are. Where's the glory years now? We need movement on energy, movement on, a kind of audacious salmon style moves on things that are even close to competence, on stuff that is absolutely pivotal to people's lives. And yet we're not getting that. I mean, we not only don't even get a mention of the word independence, but it doesn't get unpacked. And forgive me now, because we've spoken so many times about this, I don't know if I've already said it, but Jonathan Shafi's article is basically saying that it's not enough to just mention the word as a headline. You have to unpack it. And it could even be too late to do that for the next election, because fundamentally, no, I don't think many people now believe that the SNP has put much time into any proper planning or campaigning or being perky or rebuttals or any kind of focus on the issues that there are.
No, I mean the big fear I think would be that the SNP trot out some kind of half-baked Summer of Independence campaign, which is what normally happens when the SNP leadership get into a sort of sticky situation like this, which is basically neither a summer nor a campaign nor much of an independence. But it kind of looks a bit performative, or they reband the yes.scot website and relaunch it as they did in October, November time, which I think was the fourth or fifth relaunch of that type of platform, which seems to have no actual purpose to it, no follow through. You can always sign up to be some kind of supporter or an activist on these websites, but that information never falls out of the back end to anybody locally saying, Jimmy signed up to campaign for independence and, get him out there. So, it's almost, as you say, a bit too late to sort of change gear into a very heavily independence driven campaign. And as Jonathan points out, this anti-reform campaign seemed to be the main strategy for the Scottish parliamentary election next year, starting off with that summit and kind of building up this narrative that reform had to be kept out and everybody had to sort of club together in order to do that, this kind of pearl clutching mantra, which has been bust. That may well have been a kind of reasonable national strategy, but it's been proven wrong in this local by-election, and it's probably now a busted flush for the rest.
And as I understand it, there's a National Council meeting. Now, you'll again tell me, because these tend not to be tremendously feisty events, do they? But there's one for next week. It was the 20th, I think, of June. I'd spoken to somebody who is going to that and had said there had been a lot of motions put in to basically saying we have to fight this, as line one, page one independence. And that just can't be, there's the word again. This needs to be a full-throated independence campaign, which, of course, in a recent interview, John Swinney asked the question, is it line one, page one? Didn't say yes. So the apparently the upshot is that the first part of the National Council meeting will be people discussing independence, and then they'll move on to, the business as usual, I understand. And this reminds me of actually last year's conference, which started off with a session that people just basically, complained really about the lack of an independent strategy. And then it just went back into the usual conference in which independence was not mentioned. So if this is what we're heading for again, and at the risk of being, well, I was going to say labelled an agent provocateur, but basically I can clear a room of SNP officials quicker than blimmin' Donald Trump. Anyway, you guys that are going to this council meeting need to strategize about what you're going to do. Because if you really believe this, that a spark, hope, vision is needed to win an election of any kind, this is possibly the last chance saloon for trying to get some action. A lot of people I know will already say this is hopeless. And you can see that there's been, if you would have to say, probably the usual suspects calling for John Swinney to go, Alec Neil, Jim Sillars. And I think Tommy Shepherd is very critical of the approach of kind of trying to whack reform. But this is going to just continue to kind of keep niggling away this leadership issue unless something big and genuine and not a summer of whatever, as you suggested, comes out of this. So, come on, folks.
Definitely. And I mean, it's quite interesting. We're into what, the fourth or fifth day now of not just criticism of the strategy, but criticism of John Swinney's leadership. We've got front page of the National today with James Dornan backing him, which is almost as good as calling for him to resign. It equally highlights the problems. It's a bit more of the kind of wished and get behind. There's obviously very serious concerns about the strategy and where it's headed and the pace of change. I mean, talking of pace of change, in the great tradition of this podcast, I've watched something that nobody else would absolutely want to do in order to report back. I was watching the King's speech, the Discours du Trône in Canada, which was utterly boring. It took absolutely ages because the Senate building and the Commons are actually quite far apart from each other. So the two of them, when they send off Blackrod to go and get everybody, there's an absolute age of milling around waiting for him to come back. But anyway, the bottom line is that Canada is back in business in a really quite interventionist way to build houses. The Carney government is going to double the rate of house building. It's creating an entirely new house building industry called the Canadian, which we use Canadian technology, Canadian skilled workers, and Canadian timber. This Build Canada Homes plan, and they're investigating in creating a new prefabricated modular housing industry to drive up the supply and bring down the cost of houses. I mean, this is very similar to the Commonweal Home Plan of 5 years ago and the timber industry growth set out in Scotland 2070, Healthy, Wealthy and Wise, the book by Hilary Sillitoe and Dorothy and Ian Godden. So, a lot of this work had been done by the independence movement and independence thinkers and some really detailed plans, but, no decisive action of that kind of level.
Yeah, and we will come on to this thing of housing when we talk about the spending review. But just to sort of have a look at reform in all of this, I I think actually that the main tactic reform used, which was that horrible video about Anas Sarwar prioritizing the Pakistani community, which did apparently have 800,000 views by the time of the election. I think that didn't actually go anywhere, particularly in this by-election, because it just missed. It's an indication of how he just doesn't get Scotland. That really wasn't, race wasn't a factor, I think, particularly in that seat. There was probably a level of scunnerment with both governments, and essentially the local candidate came through the middle. But it's interesting because Farage was actually fairly on the money when it's something closer to his own home turf. In the by-election down south that they won, and in the local elections just before that, Farage has actually got cuter with age, and he became he didn't criticise the Birmingham bin strikers. He called for Scunthorpe and British Steel to be nationalised, and he suggested that England's water companies should be allowed to go bust, in particular Thames Water. And some of the trade union folk at the time were quoted as saying that, Farage's call to let Thames Water collapse was a breath of fresh air and the only political leader who was tackling the problem. And this is what will happen is that basically Farage is a shapeshifter. He's not a very good shapeshifter for Scotland because he's not here enough to get a kind of, a feel for things, but doubtless he'll improve. And anything, any system that has massive problems within it and doesn't basically connect well, like the entire privatized water system south of the border, that will just be an easy picking for him. Here, it was something that his candidate pushed a lot was the net zero. And there is a problem with that because, again, at the behest of the Westminster Government that controls energy, the decision has been made to pay for all the transition, and that means all the hardware, all the pylons, all the new connectors, all the rest of it. That is all being paid on bills, not on taxes. And it may sound like, six of one, half a dozen of the other, but clearly not, because obviously bills are pretty regressive in that poor folk pay more. You saw that stuff recently about folk managing to get compensation for having their houses broken into to have repayment meters put in because they defaulted on a bill at some point. So they're actually paying a higher amount for their energy. They're also probably using more of it. And on the other hand, if you put that on taxation, it is, even in, unequal Britain, it is progressive, as in folk who pay more tax. So, we have decided, we haven't, the Westminster governments have successively decided to stick with a system that loads all of those costs onto bills, which is why for the reform folk are able to jump in and say, your bills are whatever it is, a quarter, a third, or whatever it is of a green transition. And I can that if it was basically taxes, they would be gunning for that as well. They don't want to spend money on anything but oil, which is running out. And the smart countries have already shifted most of their production and their energy supplies onto stuff that has a future, thereby guaranteeing that their kit, in the case of Vestas from Denmark, their know-how, in the case of all the Nordics, their state-owned companies, in the case of Norway, Equinor, are now hoovering up the possibilities in our country. So there's lots and lots wrong with energy, none of which I ever hear the SNP talking about, but reform will continue to pick that underbelly. And when it comes to the next Scottish election, they'll be up in Angus, up in Aberdeenshire, and up in the northeast, basically saying, who wants these pylons? Do you benefit from this one iota vote reform?
Absolutely.
And if somebody doesn't tackle that properly, and they're not going to, I think, because the SNP has mostly passed much of that through its planning without extracting anything that they could have a bit of a, look, this shiny thing that we got in exchange, that's going to happen.
Yeah, and people are not seeing the benefit of cheaper renewable energy in their energy mix in their bills, as we know. And one of reform's great benefits is that people seem to be able to project anything they want onto them. It's not entirely clear what they stand for. Their policies are not very well defined and are not necessarily articulated. So they're kind of all things to all people with this background hum of racism.
And actually, just while we're at it, though, I see that. Oh, we're going to talk about.
The problem is when the sort of background racism hum kind of actually comes to the fore and becomes a bit more specific. It doesn't seem to actually do very well for them. And then your man Zia Yusuf upped and quit, and then was back 48 hours later.
But that was over, essentially.
Yeah, entirely to do.
I keep forgetting her name, Sarah Pochin.
Pochin.
Yeah, we're struggling. But anyway, the lass who won the recent by-election down south for reform, she asked a question in the Commons about urging a ban on burqas, and Zia Yusuf, who had pretty much masterminded the advance of reform from the kind of background, the backroom function. He resigned the next day, I think. He was careful enough in his resignation to make it. He said it was dumb.
It was dumb, but
yeah,
that almost
but he
gave
didn't.
me Sarah, you're doing the quiet bits out loud again. We're not we're not that racist.
They didn't actually, I don't think he actually named her, but maybe I'm wrong. But nonetheless, it was quite obvious where that was coming from. And just by the by, it seems that the guy who was leading on the so-called Doge unit within Reform, this is the Department of Government Efficiency copycat thing from the States, of which more soon in the delicious Elon Musk Donald Trump fallout chat.
Wow.
Anyway, Reform have got their own Doge unit. This guy, Nathaniel Fried, was in charge of it, and he quit the same day as Zia Youssef, presumably over those remarks by the woman whose name we cannot pronounce.
Well, and Zia has now got 4 jobs apparently, so he's coming back in to lead the Doge team. So I mean, it's up and doing and in and out.
Mm. But the thing is, we'll get next to know if anybody else was doing this amount of kind of U-turns. I think we're beginning to teeter into the next territory. It would have got a bit of interest, but not with Reform. They just, in fact, people will have noticed from the BBC, from the Nationals website, that the BBC, there's been a leak of emails and exchanges suggesting that the BBC thinks that it needs to try and produce Reform voter friendly content now, which is not just, I mean, as many of us will think it's been there for quite a long time, but not just in the news arena, but actually in dramas, which
Oh,
just beggars belief,
happy
that
days. We
we've
can have
reached this.
Nigel Farage in Coronation Street or EastEnders rather. It'll be moving into the
Because
mainstream.
just the small point is, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, because I may have got the numbers wrong. Reform have either 5 or 6 with Sarah Pochin MPs.
Yep.
Right, the SNP have 9. They're not. I appreciate everyone thinks it's like the coming storm. If you look out the window and you see the storm clouds rolling in, you go and take your washing in before you see the rain actually fall. But nonetheless, just technically and actually, we live in a blooming multiracial democracy where every point of view has got a say. But if it's proportional, there are 5 blinking MPs right now. So it's outrageous that this is even being planned by the BBC. But
And of course, it
that's
would have been
again the
6
problem.
if old Rupert Lau hadn't been suspended pending investigation. They're hardly a paradigm of virtue.
But this again is a point to make to people. The constellation of forces suggests that reform will always, there will certainly, because it's a proportional election, there will be reform MSPs. But the voting proportion south of the border is clearly higher for reform, and we'll end up having a BBC that adjusts all the programming for the license fee we all pay if we choose to, for a phenomenon that is probably not as impactful in Scotland as it will be south of the border.
Absolutely not. And you were mentioning U-turns, the kind of slowest U-turn in history. The caring, sharing Labour government have reinstated winter fuel payments for pensioners.
Indeed, yes, as you say, this is this is so profoundly not news, and yet every sort of inch of it is just so creaking. I mean, just watching Rachel Reeves plant herself amongst some unsuspecting pensioners somewhere at a kind of a wee jolly, a lunchtime jolly, and coming out with that, trademark woodenness that
Oh, it was
accompanies
great. And do
everything.
you get the bus here? Oh, that's lovely. It's like,
I wish I could actually do her accent as well. I've forgive me if I've run this theory past you before, but it's strange how often um, leaders and deputies end up having the same speech patterns. There was a stage where Nicola had very Alex kind of speech patterns. So Alex
uh,
used to do this kind of slightly arrogant thing, and then this little kind of
yeah,
I mean,
break. Yes,
we all
absolutely.
know what, yeah, this is rubbish, thing. But anyway, she and Keir Starmer have definitely got, kind of completely colourless language that just gets rattled out off to a T. Anyway, let us not
Well,
tackle
his
the
government has
message.
fixed the foundations of the economy.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because actually, I'll put the wee link in, but there's a very good analysis by Sam Coates on Sky who's pointing out that this is patently nonsense, or as he says, if you're being polite, contested. The OBR halved growth predictions this year for Britain. The OECD downgraded UK forecasts last week. And the claim that interest rates are coming down ignores the fact that their descent is slower because of government decisions taken in the last 6 months. So there isn't a sort of, hey, look, suddenly we've made loads of money and it's all so completely different. And I don't think there's a person in the country who believes that everything has improved so much. They know that this is just, classic politicians speak for, we completely messed this one up. We're never done with hearing about it. We won't see the front pages of British, English newspapers this morning, but the Sun headline is highlights the lack of an apology from Rachel Reeves over that, because in the end, I think they've saved only 450 million quid, which is nothing in the great scheme of things, by removing the entitlement from all pensioners. So, hey, nice one there. But their headline is Winter Blunderland. Get it? The Mail brands Rachel Reeves deluded, but to be fair, they probably never liked her anyway. And the Metro headline is humiliating. Get it, with the U-turn.
Boom.
So nobody's really kind of, I don't know how many brownie points they're getting from this, but there is quite a lot of other things that are beginning to unravel because of it. I mean, one is that this kind of, for an Iron Chancellor, as Rachel Reeves had presented herself, there's the first little bit of unraveling from her, sacred rules. The next one is what happens now to things like the cuts in personal independence payments, the PIP payments that mostly come for disabled people, and the two-child benefit cap. If people don't like that, why would they not campaign all the harder now? Because there's been one climb down already. And why logically would you hammer ahead with these ones? Because they will now become the new focus for all the soft left in the Labour Party and beyond, in the wider community and Scotland.
Absolutely. And, okay, the two-child cap is already in there. So whilst everybody is feeling that pain, and we're seeing the comparative stats in England versus Scotland for the amount of child poverty, this change to the entitlement for PIP is going to affect a lot of people, and it's going to be a change. It's going to be a massive change. And, even all these new shiny Labour MPs are going to be facing that every single week in their constituency surgeries. As a lot of people come to their Member of Parliament for help and support filling in their PIP form. And if they're now losing points and they're losing entitlement, they're going to be feeling that front and centre in their offices, and be back on complaining in their backbench meetings directly to Rachel. So, I mean, I don't see the advantage of this winter fuel decision to begin with. It was just kind of, look at me, I'm big and tough, I can take these hard decisions. It was a bit of a weird one. It's been reinstated now, but it's taken them forever to actually get their U-turn through. So again, that wasn't even a particularly clever or smart way to go about things. It's just kind of slowly rolled itself out and been finally confirmed today. And of course, if you earn over £35,000, it's going to be complicatedly clawed back through the tax system. And then no sooner has it been done, we've got the Labour Party and the same Paul O'Kane out this morning saying that the SNP must now re-examine their proposals, because they were only offering everybody £100 rather than the 200 that's been offered by the UK government. You're like, well, we've only had known about it for 20 minutes.
Just as you were sort of watching something in Canada for everybody else's sake, I was listening to Ian Murray, the Scottish Secretary, this morning, Good Morning Scotland, while you were off sourcing a microphone. And actually a very good feisty interview by Laura Maxwell there, where to kind of cut to the chase, he basically got, pummeled around with it all, and then claimed that the SNP would only be giving £100 to all pensioners, at which Laura Maxwell jumped in and said, that's not correct. Everyone will get at least £100, but people over the age of 80 on pension credit will get 305 quid. People on pension credit under the age of 80 will get 203 quid. Now, presumably, since they've only discovered since yesterday that there will be more money coming to them in Barnett consequentials because of the change of their own policy at Westminster, there could be, they could change their minds yet as to how they deal with this. But that is what's on offer, because there was hee-haw coming from Westminster. So how these guys, the brass neck is amazing. The next line Ian Murray came out with was, after he was corrected by Laura Maxwell, which he didn't go back into any argument about the figures. He said, but why are the SNP giving money to millionaire pensioners? So that's going to be the next one, because they've got their clawback through taxation thing. That's the way they've decided to approach it. I would just have thought people will be a lot less worried about that than just their initial stance and kind of, hasty backtracking and all the rest of it. And the fact that they have not explained how they're going to fund it. I mean, I can remember when the SNP decided they were going to come out and reinstate some kind of winter fuel payment from, again, mitigating from their own money, a Westminster policy, and then said also they would do the same with a two-shall cap. And all Labour had to say was, where will the money come from? How are you going to fund it? Well, hello, how is this going to be funded? Because there has no detail has been come up with yet. And the speculation is doubtless it's going to come from increased taxation, and that will hover over Labour all summer now until they get to the budget at the other end.
Absolutely. And there also kind of seems to be a bit of a divide between the Chancellor and the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister keeps getting sort of slightly talked into, oh, yes, we'll look at it. Oh, yes, we're considering all these things. And the Chancellor's much more, absolutely not. We've got the spending review coming up, which I think is going to be quite tight for a number of UK departments.
Indeed, and we were talking about the housing earlier. At an English level, this falls to Angela Rayner. And she's got 1.5 million houses, affordable houses to build, which I think everyone has said is kind of not possible, and certainly not possible unless really major amounts of money were pushed her way. As it is, major amounts of money have been pushed in a different direction, which is towards finishing Sizewell C. And you have the figures on that, my
Happy
dear.
days. It's a 14.2 billion, I think 2 point something of which had already been announced, taking it up to 17 billion in total for costs for this new nuclear power station at Sizewell.
Which is just, I mean, we could talk about, we've talked about all of this before, but that will actually come out of bills paid by us in Scotland. They are, of course, now on the front foot thanks to that election result. And again, they had Tom Greatrix on, who used to be a Labour MP, I think, and is now the spokesperson for the nuclear movement, for the nuclear energy industry. And he's basically saying, the Scottish government's behind the curve. The decision not to have nuclear approved by planning in Scotland is bad news. And in fact, the kicker, the punchline on the interview with Ian Murray was that when, as he puts it, Scotland votes Labour and Anas Sarwar is First Minister, we will reverse the SNP's veto on nuclear power.
Vote Labour and we'll give you a shiny new nuclear power station.
Yeah, instead of, and this is again the points that have to be, really pushed home. We very probably need some kind of baseload energy, and we've had, the extra podcast we did with two energy experts went into a lot of this in great depth. But there's all sorts of technologies that will never get their chance. Every time nuclear kicks in, research and support for wave energy, tidal energy just dries up completely. And it looks like that cycle, which began so many years ago, is about to happen again because all the big money is going into nuclear, and that will now be presented by the Westminster Labour government and by Labour here as the sort of smart, technocratic, clean way to reach net zero through clean energy. Now, I mean, we could have a long conversation about how clean anyone feels Dounreay was with the shaft that was denied. Its existence was even denied for the best part of 20 years, the radioactive shaft. Of course, they'll say, yeah, but that was then and everything's better now. And it's, yeah, fine. We have got enough energy in Scotland. I mean, we've already over 100% renewable energy. We do need something that's baseload, but we should be deciding ourselves which technology we want to use. The nuclear industry is taking decades on planning and the investment in it. The reason I think partly that the British government has come to the rescue is because private industry, there's squillions sitting in the City of London. Why are they not investing in Sizewell C? because it's bad news. That's why. And it may, never come out safely out the other end. So we don't need that. We need something. We need our own mix, and we need advances in our own mix, and we need a government in the SNP that keeps making that point and explaining it.
And you've been looking at renewables on Applecross and some of the challenges there.
Indeedy. Well, people may have already got a drift of this one, but I know one of the women who who did almost an impossible thing. Applecross, little peninsula up in the northwest, overlooking Skye, on the other side of the Bealach na Bo or Ba, depending on which Gaelic you're using. 250 people live there, and they managed to raise £750,000 in 2015 to get some Westminster funding to create a community hydro. Happy days. The community hydro would get income, and they could spend that on everything that the state basically and the council don't give to a remote peninsula like them. However, there was a problem, which is that the grid that goes across to Applecross, and you need to feed into the grid to get money paid back out to it, that grid is a teeny weeny useless grid, which is basically full if you sneeze. I do exaggerate for effect. But the small community hydro, which was 90 kilowatts, could only export 50 kilowatts into the grid and be paid for that. And that meant it couldn't put a second one in. It's lost huge amounts of money over the 10 years it's waited for SSE, which is a private company, thanks to Thatcher. The privatization of the energy industry was done in such a way that a private company, not the state, makes the decisions about which grid connections go ahead in a way that no other country in Europe does. So SSE has kind of looked at the wee folk over in Applecross and gone, nah. Actually, just to be fair, they've looked at Orkney, energy rich, Shetland, awash with wind energy, the Western Isles, same story, and also thought, nah, until extremely recently. But Applecross still stuck, and stuck for all these years since 2015, not able to export. What does that mean as well? It means there's no three-phase energy on the peninsula. It's been a bit of an education session for me. That's the kind of energy you need to be able to run a business. What that means is that the Applecross Inn has not, for example, got electric showers. It has got showers in each room, but they just can't be primed by electricity because there's not enough about. 7 in 10 people live in fuel poverty. There's another commercial hydro, again expecting to have a decent grid connection, which is why millions were put in by two brothers who live in Argyll. It's been exporting 1/40th of its capacity for about 5 years. So I was going up to show the Denmark film in Applecross, which definitely was like rubbing people's noses in it when they saw the island of Samso, which is energy self-sufficient in Denmark, pulling in all the energy it produces there for the people on the island. And thought we might as well make a film while we're here about the pickle that Applecross finds itself in. That film's been online for a week. I think it's had about 15,000 views. Definitely SSE, who did finally apply for a grid upgrade in 2022. It's been sitting in the Scottish Government's planning in tray since then, which is 3 years, to get a decision. It's part of a general improvement of the grid from Fort Augustus to Skye. So that has stalled for such a long time. Yesterday, as I was looking to see, what had happened with it, I got an email from SSE saying basically yesterday the Scottish Government approved the grid upgrade.
And that would be nothing at all to do with the press inquiry or the film. Post hoc ergo proctor hot after this, therefore, because I'm sure that just fell out just naturally in the process.
Yes, I'm sure there's nothing to do with it at all. Although it seems to have, gathered dust and stalled for quite a long time. Still, we'll put the link up. It's worth people, particularly on that other route, having a look at quite where the grid upgrade will go. They're undergrounding it for 15 kilometres past the Cuillins and 9 kilometres approaching Fort Augustus. So a lot of decisions have been taken by the Scottish Government because there was quite a lot of contestation along the route. So it's good for people everywhere else to have a look at it. And I would humbly suggest it would be very good for the people of Applecross to keep the foot on the throttle, show the film, which they are intending to do in this month, and invite SSE to come up and explain when that new grid will come so that, there's the possibility of, for example, the Applecross brewery, which is currently not situated on Applecross because there's no three-phase energy, businesses could actually think about siting there. So, for example, there's no public charging point for electric vehicles. That's a livener when you've come over the Bialach. That is not a future-proofed community because, all the targets are there for conversion to electric cars. They can't do it as things stand. All these things, the film translates, again, it's a bit like Independence, just translates this abstraction into here's how people's lives are being impacted on all of this. So come on, Applecross, just get the guys up there and put them through their paces. And everybody else, have a look at the film.
Yeah, well, we'll make sure that link is in the show notes, but it's on Leslie's YouTube page, which you can find very easily, a quick search. And from electricity to sparks flying, the Don and Elon have had a big falling out, which has been more spectacular than anybody could have imagined. I think we were all waiting for it and hoping for it. Elon maybe needs to lay off the old Special K and the magic mushrooms. He's been doing some angry tweets, and Donald's not been happy.
Yeah, it's hard to know actually. I must say I must have taken my eye off this somewhat. I think this all began to start happening when I was in Orkney and having a happy week off. But I mean, it's culminated in Musk obviously leaving the government and suggesting that he wants to start his own party, the America Party, because he put a tweet out on his own network and 80% of people thought it was a blooming good idea. Um, that seems to be not likely to happen. You've got,
I think
because we've
yeah.
done this twice. I know you've got such
how would
interesting
you
stuff
possibly know this?
about SpaceX.
Well, SpaceX is huge. I mean, the Donald obviously was not very happy about being called a paedophile or being dobbed in for being on the Epstein flight logs. Musk donated something like $290 million to the Trump campaign. That's about £124 million. And Donald was then saying, oh, well, maybe the best way for the US government to save money would be to cancel some of SpaceX's contracts. Since 2008, they reckon the US government contracts have been worth something in the region of $20.9 billion to SpaceX. That's about £16.3 billion. But it's almost kind of too big to fail. The big changer, the game changer that SpaceX have, of course, is that they've got this booster rocket stage that they can catch. You'll probably have seen the videos of it where it kind of slowly comes back down to land and then gets grabbed by the arm of the sort of tower. And that means that they can refurbish and reuse that booster section and bring their cost of launch down. So it's really improved the efficiency and reduced the costs, and also means that they can launch much more frequently, which is hugely attractive to the US government and the Pentagon and NASA. SpaceX across the whole of the world did something like 83% of all spacecraft launch. Which is about 134 launches in comparison to the EU's Ariane group, where they had only 3. So, it's a big player and it's the cheapest. So it's a problem. You've got the old taco Trump. Trump always backs down or caves in. He seems to have quietened down on the cancelling of the contracts. And I think you were saying some of the more dodgier tweets have also been wheaked off Twitter.
Yeah, that the one about the connections with Epstein apparently was deleted, and there was another one later where he'd backed somebody who was calling for Trump to resign. But I see now, looking at it, that it's the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and God Almighty, this sort of sprawling bill that Trump has backed, that was described by Musk as a disgusting abomination. This is still potentially on the go as a kind of live issue because it narrowly passed the House of Representatives, but apparently it still needs to go through the Senate. And if they make any changes, it has to go back to the House again. And Musk is continuing to really push against it. And here's another one. I mean, this, I don't know if he was on the mushrooms at this point, but he apparently wrote on Twitter, I'm sorry, I'm just not calling it X anymore, Trump has 3.5 years left as president. I will be around for 40 years. So, I mean, I'm sure people will think these guys fall out with each other and then regroup, and they certainly do seem to be able to. Trump particularly seems to be able to suggest that Putin, whoever it is either his closest friend and then a bit of a weird guy. He shifts across the spectrum at a rate of knots, but it looks like there's still, there's going to be a battle yet over that bill, which Musk will think of various tactics to try and influence.
Definitely. And, you've got all sorts of troops in California. You've gone from having the National Guard to actually calling up the Marines to deal with these protests against the really heavy-handed immigration enforcement that's going on there, which the governor of California doesn't want. Nobody else seems to want the National Guard there, never mind actual proper full-time serving troops. I mean, it's a very dangerous situation. You get a whole bundle of very twitchy guys with guns. Something is going to go wrong eventually. There was an Australian TV presenter shot with a plastic bullet the other day. There was a coverage of, and I think a British cameraman who ended up having to go to hospital to have part of a plastic bullet removed from his leg. It's a really serious situation.
Who actually was watching that, who said that he predicts that basically there will be live rounds shot soon.
Unquestionably. I mean, you can't have that amount of firepower in such a small amount of space without something going wrong at some point. And sadly, as we've seen, once these guys start shooting, it's impossible to rein it in without doing huge amounts of damage.
Well, just while we're on that, I'm just noticing 40 minutes ago, the UK has decided to sanction Israeli ministers over their comments on Gaza.
Well, that's quite a size up from
Ben
pretending to do
Gvir
stuff.
and Bezalel Smotrich both face a travel ban entering the UK and will have UK assets frozen as part of measures announced by David Lammy. I mean, okay, that's something. I have to say that at the same time, the news is reporting 300 Foreign Office staff who raised concerns about UK complicity in Israel's disregard for international law. And we're now watching just, it's all bets are off, firing at people desperately trying to get food supplies, then lying about what happened. It's just, and actually, there was a piece on Channel 4 suggesting that the Palestinians who have been deployed by the Israelis in their so called humanitarian effort were actually agreed to be the people who had been looting aid. So they are basically BAMs who are being used by the Israelis to distribute aid now, the guys who'd actually got the biggest reputation for stealing it. Anyway, 300 Foreign Office staff raised concerns about UK complicity of all this, and they are apparently outraged after the civil service told them your ultimate recourse is to resign from the civil service. So that's where things are at the moment with this. And, until there's going to presumably, once again, and I'm thinking on my feet here because we've just literally seen this, but this, the easiest thing to do rather than to take any stance on Gaza is to sanction two people that are, that are
Well,
kind of,
it's a coalition. They were the kind of worst of the worst.
yes,
That's the kind of pick you off. We'll still send a trade ambassador, and we'll still send you all the stuff you need, and we'll still provide you with spy planes out of our military bases. And we're not going to kick up too much of a fuss that a UK registered vessel was part of the Freedom Flotation, the coalition that
absolutely.
Greta Thunberg was huckled off of. We're not going to, get into that, but here's a wee bit of red meat for the gallery. I mean, it still feels really just performative. It's the kind of front of house stuff as opposed to what's really happening in the back rooms.
Yeah, and it's not gonna, even the Israelis trying to portray Greta Thunberg and all the people on as a selfie yacht, the one that was essentially, the Israelis essentially kidnapped the people who were on board
Yeah,
it because it
in
was
international
international
waters.
waters, but it was a UK registered yacht as far as I understand. And again, all sorts of calls for intervention by the UK government, absolutely nada. So this is just another kind of, little attempt to deflect, but this issue is just not going to go away.
Yeah, and okay, I don't accept the selfie yacht thing. They were there as part of a campaign. They didn't genuinely think they were going to get any of their aid across, but they were there to highlight it in the most visible and internationally resonant way they could, because the things that are happening there are just appalling.
Aye. Uh-huh. Yes. So, what are we left with now to discuss?
Well, I mean, so we're just coming up to the 1 hour mark. We've got some good news in that the Isle of Bute boat company of Ardmalish has managed to successfully launch a ferry for Calmac, and Ruth McGuire has announced that she's cancer free and that she's going to be able to return to Holyrood after the summer recess.
Which is indeed good news. She'll be able to come back to what we were also going to discuss, which was how to respond to Keir Starmer saying there will never, ever, 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 ever be an independence referendum on his watch.
Yes, talk to the hand. I mean, again, very flat response to that from the SNP or from the government at a national level. You were involved in creating that activist letter, but there's not much smedum or outrage, and there's very little detailed work going on.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of people, when Keir Starmer came up with that, I mean, kind of obvious it was going to be asked question on Good Morning Scotland about a second indie ref, and that kind of out of hand rejection was just utterly instinctive on his part. It's just a no. It doesn't matter if it's not consistent. His explanation was that Labour last year got such a majority that they had a mandate essentially to do whatever they wanted. And then, of course, the point is, well, if there's an independence majority at the next Scottish elections, does that not create a mandate to do that? I mean, it's a bit like, to paraphrase James Robertson, the mandate where you are. I mean, like if it's a big proper one where we are, then that lets us have carte blanche. If it's only where you are, it's nothing.
Yeah, it
And I'm sure
doesn't count.
people will go, yeah, well, okay, we sort of know that. But I really think we've got to just act like we have our own expectations of democracy. We may be weary, but you can't let it all slip and not even bother to respond because, I mean, people notice the absence of a reaction. It's a bit like, I always think it's like, when you go to the doctors and they have that wee hammer thing and they hit you beneath the knee. I always say it's astonishing when your knee just swings up without you doing anything about it. That's a proper reaction. Well, this has got to have a proper reaction. And other yesers, the Scottish public, they notice when nobody bothers their collective arse on this stuff. And actually, people south of the border just think they've all gone home. And we haven't all gone home. So, I mean, it's worth challenging all the thinking in this stuff because I know Might is right, and Starmer will obviously not waver on a lot of his thinking. But the ideas that he's putting forward have got to be challenged because he said the other thing he said was that nobody says independence is a top priority to him. Now, Paul Kavanagh wrote a very good article observing that security around Starmer means no normal person probably gets to raise anything with him. So
Yeah, of all the Scottish punters I've chatted to in the last 12 months, nobody's ever brought that up. Well, there's a surprise.
yeah, he's been here kind of twice and he had minders every time. So, whatever. But still, that's like the abstract point scoring that does not work. It might work. We've got to get down to what that's actually about because some people might nod and say, actually, I'm sure that polling finds that independence isn't the top issue either. But I'll tell you what is. It is probably sky high energy prices controlled by Westminster. Fuel poverty is determined by Westminster. Benefits and most of the welfare state, Westminster. Grangemouth abandoned by Westminster and not nationalised. Trident renewed by Westminster. Privatised public services as a template for the whole UK that we didn't vote for, imposed by Westminster. The grid connections we've just discussed there, SSE, courtesy of Westminster. And actually, there was a very interesting survey done that day, which discovers that Britain is the OECD's most regionally unbalanced advanced economy, courtesy of Westminster. So, like, that's the argument, and that's the stuff that we need to keep emphasizing here.
Unquestionably, and it needs a proper, thoroughgoing activity, not just little tweaks up here and there to sort of keep the gallery happy. We need to see long term sustained action on these matters and some real chutzpah. I mean, you've got Plaid Cymru in Wales polling ahead of the other parties. I'm not saying they're necessarily going to end up forming the government, and they had a real problem when they went into coalition with Labour at the last time. But Plaid are at 30%, Labour at 18%, Reform 25%. You could envisage a situation where Plaid Cymru had a Salmon-style minority government in Wales doing sort of big, sexy nationalist things, and the SNP are looking even more stale and boring by comparison.
And actually, this was something that Gordon McIntyre Kemp talked about at a recent Saltire lunch. You could add on to that Sinn Féin could be doing big, sexy stuff in Northern Ireland. So
Yep.
you've actually got nationalist governments in all three Celtic countries. That would put the heat a little bit more on, on Labour in Westminster for sure. But the comparison would certainly be unfortunate if we don't see something friskier happening in Scotland.
More friskiness definitely required.
Yes. So have
On that
we
note,
managed to
we've
get,
we've
yes.
got through everything. We managed to sidestep poor Douglas getting thrown out of the debating chamber at Holyrood and
Yeah.
getting right in a tiz about it, but I think nobody cares about that, my dear.
No, they don't. Correctly divined. Well, thank you very much for, being up all night, worrying about how this would all get recorded, doing it twice, finding a kind of microphone that worked. And then, if anyone is listening to this at all, editing and uploading it, So Pat, I hope you're feeling better in anybody's versions of Wheel or Nay Wheel, and we'll have you back next week, batting away. But in the meantime, thank you very much, Fraser, for stepping in. It's been excellent. And leave it to you to say.
See you next time, folks.